Today we welcome a special guest, flown in fresh this morning, and I'll just turn over to Julian, who is going to start our in-conversation session. A man who needs no introduction, so I'm allowing him to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Sue, and hello everybody. So I don't think I'm really well known, so I'm Julian Sefton-Green and I work at Deakin University. And it's a real pleasure, both personally and professionally, to be able to sit here and riff with Mizuko Ito. Mimi, I don't think you can really be described as fresh if you've just flown in, actually, to be fair, but we won't go into that, perhaps. So Mimi is professor in residence, which I only thought really happened to like musicians and things like that, at University of California, Irvine. She's a cultural anthropologist by training and has written and led projects, seminal projects, and produced key texts examining the ways in which digital culture has changed youth and the way that youth have driven digital culture. And what we're going to do today, and you probably also know, sorry to state the obvious, she's the director of the Connected Learning Lab, which is the institutionalization of the Connected Learning Research Network, and which was a project that Mimi led and drove from 2011 to 2018. Is that about right? Sounds about right, okay. And I was lucky enough to be involved in that project. So what we're going to try and do today is reflect on the key principles and concepts, but also the institutional practices which led to the growth of the Connected Learning Research Network, and try and position that historically and conceptually. And we'll talk quite generally about those sorts of things for hopefully about 30 minutes, and then we'll deliberately leave a proper length of time for conversation so you can join in. So, but the plan is basically to sort of try and uncover the history behind the Connected Learning Network and talk a bit to Mimi and get her take on her personal involvement in that. And we'll see where we end up. So, as I've just said, the Connected Learning Research Network, which is a particular form of funding a set of projects and scholars, was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And that came out of the MacArthur Foundation's investment in something called digital media learning, which predated the Connected Learning Research Network. So Mimi, perhaps if you wouldn't mind, you could tell us a little bit about how you got involved with the network, how you got involved with MacArthur, and how it perhaps related to your own interests and scholarship, and how you perhaps think you might have influenced the network, or whether the network influenced you.
Okay, thanks, Julian. That was a lot of questions. I'll just tell the story as I remember it, probably with a faulty memory. But so when the MacArthur Initiative started, before it was even named the Digital Media and Learning Initiative, I think I was a postdoc at USC, and there was curiosity in the foundation about these new technologies around digital games becoming networked. I think it was still maybe MySpace was barely out, and Friendster had maybe just been around and crashing, and it was pretty early days. Mobile was starting to take off. And one of the board members of the foundation, John Seely Brown, is someone that kind of intersects with this community, has been in the learning sciences and technology for quite some time, used to head the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, and really was pretty instrumental in bringing what we call now human-centered computing into the industry context. But he was on the board and was really pushing the foundation to consider, what all of these changes that are happening around learning in the wild, kids' everyday practice with technologies, because we came from this tradition of sociocultural learning theory where we were looking at learning as a property of social engagement and cultural connection. And, I think these kinds of frameworks are a little bit more taken for granted now, but they were fairly countercultural at the time. And all, kids were starting to play with this new technology and going online to learn things. And it was all very new. And somehow he convinced the foundation to not only look at this, but then hire some ethnographers to actually observe what kids were doing, which is very unusual, at least in the US context, to get larger sustained funding for fairly open-ended ethnographic inquiries. So that was the work that initially, together with Henry Jenkins, who got funded to do work on media literacy, and Nicole Pinkard, who was funded, and I think Katie Salen was funded for the Quest to Learn game-based school. Nicole Pinkard was supported to do work on around digital media literacy programming for youth of color in Chicago. So there was sort of these early investments, but ours was the one, just go out and see what kids are doing and how they're learning differently with this new technology, which Peter Lyman and Michael Carter, who are more senior scholars in this space, brought me in because there were maybe 2 people on the planet at that point who had done digital youth ethnography. It didn't really exist as a field. So I think I was kind of lucky, right? I didn't really, and that grew into this, $3 million project with 20 investigators that ran for 3 years, and then eventually the initiative was launched, and then we had the opportunity, the foundation ended up over the course of about 15 years investing about $200 million. And one of the anchors from a research perspective was the Connected Learning Research Network, which Julian and other folks like Sonia Livingstone, were part of. And it was a unique model. So the MacArthur networks are a very unique funding mechanism, which I think is fairly inspired and also fairly unusual. And when they see like an emerging new area that's ripe for interdisciplinary inquiry and sort of new paradigm building, they fund a group of like 8 to 15 scholars to it has to be interdisciplinary, it has to be a new and emerging area. And the only thing we're required to do is show up 4 times a year and spend time with each other. And so it was a very unique model. So we hung out a lot, 4 times a year, mostly because Sonia and Julian were in the UK. We occasionally met in London, but mostly we just circulated through the institutions of the members, and we were forced to sort of confront sort of our disciplinary differences. And then we also had the advantage of this research network being funded in tandem with these efforts in practice, like the work that Nicole and Katie were doing in building new kinds of programs. There were folks being funded to develop new games, and so there was always an element of design and practice that ran alongside the research, which I think was also really important in keeping us slightly honest, though always hard to get researchers to really be that connected to the realities of practice.
Thanks for that. Okay, so yes, when you were speaking like that, it reminded me that it was a matter of some amusement that Sonia and I, she was still is at the London School of Economics. We were the only exotic other non-Americans involved in the network, and this was a network significantly motivated by questions of equity and social justice. So it was all about trying to explore the ways in which technological change might be creating new opportunities for young people who've been socially marginalized. So I just want to kind of raise that at this stage. So you've done a little bit scoping the history in the early 2000s. I think many people here might be familiar with a couple of volumes that MacArthur produced, 5 kind of key textbooks, which are edited volumes. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more now about the actual network itself. You've been quite gentle about the idea of interdisciplinary expertise and bringing different scholars together. And here in the Connected Child, the Digital Child Center, we also have this kind of remit for multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinarity, depending on which day of the week it is. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the actual key projects in the Connected Learning Research Network and perhaps how they developed, and then perhaps also how the projects might contribute to the emergence of what became a model for connected learning.
Yeah, I was really delighted to see kind of the mix of different types of presentations and backgrounds in the program here, because it really feels like you are working across sort of, empirical work, critical, humanistically informed perspectives, technology design, educational practice and policies, which is fantastic that you have this mix represent at the event, which I'm assuming reflects the, ethos and structure of the center as well. It may be different in this context, and you may do this all the time, but when I was starting out with the MacArthur Initiative, that, I don't know, it just doesn't happen that much. I think there's been a growing movement towards what, like Bill Penuel, who was part of our network, has been really pushing like research practice partnerships and research in the service of practice, and sort of getting what are the processes and funding mechanisms so that we can disrupt some of the incentive structures of the academy that tend to disincentivize work that's responsive to real life community and institutional practices. I think it's a work in progress because the context of academic production and promotion, all of these things really, at least in the context that I work, don't really give people credit or space to do externally facing work that is about long-term partnership building, not the kind of drive-by, dip in, do the transactional study in the school, and then, which is what I think the traditional model, if you're going to be efficient and productive as a researcher, would have you do. So the MacArthur Network, I think, gave us some space to breathe because we had the funding, and then we had this remit to be doing this for probably 10 years. The networks usually last about 10 to 15 years, and there's the funding for us to get together and some for research, plus the innovative projects being funded separately. But it was honestly pretty interesting and challenging, even with that amount of support, to get this very diverse group of well-established senior scholars to like have some sort of mind meld. And when we went in, we had this grand plan about, okay, Jean and Craig are going to run a survey, and then Bill is going to do this, and then Mimi and Katie are going to do these qualitative studies, and they're all going to beautifully integrate into like a narrative that is empirically sound and theoretically robust and driven by the problems of practice and all that. And of course, it doesn't really work that way, because we're dealing with real people who have, a lot of disciplinary commitments to doing things in a certain way. But I think I definitely learned a lot as somebody trying to facilitate this and feeling responsible for a collective output. Like, everybody's perfectly capable of doing their own studies and writing their own things. I mean, that's not really an issue. Like, we selected, we were very intentional in how we selected our advisors and scholars. But I think the big thing that I learned was, at a very high level, we all want the same thing, right? We want technologies that are genuinely serving the interests of diverse young people. We want it to be grounded in evidence. We want a more equitable society. We don't want technology to increase equity gaps, which it has a tendency to do. So there's absolutely no dispute in terms of the broader values and the societal goals. But once you get into the weeds of research practice, there is so much tension. And we've been trained to build our reputations on saying something different, not, just yes, one plus oneing somebody else's work. We don't build our relationships just by saying, yeah, what she said. That's not what's going to build your reputation. So there's a lot of kind of, just ingrained cultural and social practices. I think the thing that was most helpful for me was understanding and really trying to frame the different studies in the network as, a series of research that's more empirical diagnostic, so what we often call the critical research, which is to say, look, this is how the world really is, and it's really bad, and here are the problems and inequities, and we're scholars who are like invested in calling those things out. Incredibly important work, but the diagnosis is not the solution. The diagnosis is the diagnosis. We need to understand the problem first, but then like Henry and I get framed as like the Pollyanna, like everything is great, look at these amazing things kids are doing, look at the potential of digital media, you know, there's so much learning potential, blah, 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 blah. And then the critical folks are like, oh my God, what planet are you on? You are being so incredibly unrealistic. And then figuring out how to position like the work that Julia and Sonia did, which was sort of a representative school. I know you don't use those words, but it wasn't a school that was selected to be digitally savvy or, you know, any of these special characteristics of, say, like the Quest to Learn school or some of the work that Nicole was doing in Chicago, versus the work that like Katie, Henry Jenkins, and I were doing, which was really specifically looking at spaces of potential. And again, we're not necessarily in the solution space, at least mine, it's like naturally occurring youth-centered affinity groups. That's what Katie and I went looking for. It's like, okay, this is not typical, but this shows you what the internet and games could be if these positive conditions were met. And we're not claiming, I think we, folks like myself, I can't claim that this is all kids. But I can claim that it's possible. And that it's sort of the transition to the solution-oriented work where, you know, I would put folks like Katie Salen and Nicole Pinkard clearly more in the design space. I'm still an empirical researcher. I just go looking for what kids are doing and lift up the positive stuff without ignoring the fact that, you know, this isn't what most kids are experiencing. And then, you know, folks like Katie and Nicole and people who design cool new technology are really saying, ideally informed by both the critical diagnostic and the more positive solution-seeking research to design spaces, programs, technologies that amplify and elevate that positive potential. So I think really once we started to parse and stopped like this back and forth about like you're not being critical enough, you're being too critical, like that kind of non-productive dialogue, I think started to, I don't know, Julian, if this narrative conforms at all to your belief or your experience, but I felt like at least for me that clarified. And then we had a group of like quantitative empirical researchers who are also a little bit different from the sociocultural critical researchers, but probably more in the empirical diagnostic space. But then, you know, even with the quant stuff, you have folks that are more in the formative solution space and starting to really parse out which part of this party are you engaged in, and we're all in the same team, but we have different functions. And that took some time for us to sort out, I think.
No, I really agree with that, and I think the story you're telling now is a story after the fact. So, the kind of negotiations and settling that needs to happen can only take place with a long-term investment like MacArthur did provide, and what you're saying echoes some of the challenges facing us in the Digital Child Centre here, because it just takes a bit of time for people to kind of work out how to do this together and how to build up the trust.
That's right.
Which is really important. So I have I'm looking at the time here, and I think we've got to finish at 1:45. Is that right? So we've got 15 more minutes. I'm going to sort of summarize what I thought we might talk about and then move on to a question. Till 10, okay. Yeah, absolutely, yeah, no. So, you've just been talking a lot about the relationship between the kind of two sides of the the critical and the normative kind of tension, which runs through the whole of social sciences anyway, as forever and ever. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how this initiative was able to get seen and to have impact and be made visible, and how there's both, you're now the director of the Connected Learning Lab, is that right? And you also, one of the spin-offs or translation impacts of the Connected Learning Research Network is to set up a non-for-profit project, Connected Camps. And one of the ambitions behind both of those things is the challenge of how do we institutionalize and turn activity in, how do we make it have a legacy and make a difference? Do you want to talk a little bit more about, because connected learning was more than just getting a bunch of people together to write books.
That's right. Yeah, and I think this, is a tension with, philanthropic or government funding in sort of new and emerging areas, or what often gets called like catalytic funding in the U.S. philanthropy scene. Like, here's an opportunity, we're going to throw some money at it, and we're going to catalyze something. But that's very different from like sustaining funding or institutionalized funding, which allows for that steady drumbeat and for the practice to get rooted in places and communities and institutions. And that's not what the MacArthur funding was. And so I've been, a lot of us that were part of the initiative have been subsequently, after the MacArthur funding went away, trying to figure out which pieces are going to be sustained and how they're going to be sustained, which is a completely different project than thinking big thoughts and, writing books and things like that. So, as Julian said, one of the experiments that Katie and Salen and I have been running now for, I think it's coming up on 8 years, is when Minecraft became so popular, we started a nonprofit that was trying to figure out a business model for how we could run online summer camps and after-school programs and platforms like Minecraft and Roblox, and have a revenue stream from educational institutions and families who wanted to pay college students to mentor the littler ones. And that's still going. During the pandemic, it completely blew up. Now it's sort of right-sized itself, but sort of like a steady thing. And then Katie has recently, with the same team, because basically we're training these college-age mentors to, be kind to young people and how to support them to not grief each other's builds when they go on the server, and all of these things that, are about supporting healthy development and social emotional learning in digital spaces. And she's partnered with a group called Experience Camps that runs in-person summer camps for children who have lost a caregiver or a close family member. And it's a social support system for them. And they're rolling it out on Discord and Minecraft now, and our counselors are staffing them. So these are just sort of examples of figuring out where there's little institutionalizable pockets with sustainable funding. And then this event is, part of the Connected Learning Alliance, which is, again, how do we keep, a sustainable community model? And Michael's been a great partner in trying to figure out, like, even just convenings and events and just keeping, like, a blog going and a newsletter for people to be aware of. It's not a huge infrastructure, but, we moved the annual summit to a fully online model. And this is the very first event where we're experimenting, because people miss getting together in person, with, having regional hosts for in-person events, and then the annual online summit. And Hyun-san and Michael, have all been part of the design and experimentation of this model. And so that's kind of the shape of what it looks like to institutionalize. And then I've been, as Julian said, trying to instill, like, we recruited about 8 faculty from the broader national network to UC Irvine and started a research lab that's like based in a single institution, as a grounding. And I'm going through this long and very involved process of establishing an institute on campus. But that's just what it looks like, at least on the ground for me, and what it means to say, like, okay, here's this sort of big transformative framework and how we think about learning in a digitally networked world. But what is the kind of everyday, very, maybe less exciting, but probably more impactful at the end of the day work of, just building the structures so that it can continue rather than just be a thing that we look back fondly on as a has-been moment.
Thanks very much. Just before I open up for questions, I've got one more question, which I'm going to cheat and give you a choice of two questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to either ask you to look back or to look forward. And in asking you to look back, I want you to think about, the invitation is to think about the relationship of the Connected Learning Initiative and the really extraordinary revisioning of the values of the internet and internet culture that have taken place over the last 20 years. So the effects of Cambridge Analytica scandal, Trump, Brexit, the fact that when we started, the internet was not perceived as a force for manipulation, control, and surveillance. So that's the looking back option you can choose. And the looking forward question is, we developed a model of learning between discrete spheres of activity and experience in people's lives, young people's lives particularly. Given the tsunami of changes that may be heralded by AI and ChatGPT and things like that, I wondered whether you've got any thoughts about the ways in which the Imago network, so that's the Imago model, so that's an acronym taken from your book, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, which proposes a form of iterative, progressive learning through different kinds of experiences. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts about whether that connected learning model, how that might play out with AI. So you've got a choice of questions, which is a bit of a cheat, obviously, and then we'll throw it open for discussion, yeah?
So I'm going to look back to look forward, and I'll try to answer both. So I've been reflecting on this AI issue just because we all are right now. And, I think one of the things, so there's these resilient social patterns and power dynamics that have happened with all of the waves of technology that I've been part of during my career, starting with, mobile phones and network games, digital media, social media, and now AI. And I think that's going to be the same, right? So it's always like you will expect youth-driven innovation. Kids are going to do unexpected things with the technology, and they are going to be at the absolute center of the social and cultural innovation, which industry will appropriate and fuel and make problematic, like we saw in 2016. And young people will always be trying to keep one step ahead. And it's also inevitable that the grown-ups will panic and try to crack down on youth innovation and radically underestimate how innovative young people are going to be with technology. So I think that's going to happen with AI. But I feel like, I was one of the grown-ups that completely underestimated, maybe on the flip side, how awful grown-ups could be when they had access to these tools because the kids were so awesome. And so like the internet that I studied in the first wave of research where, kids were, queer kids were finding each other online, and like anime fans from Japan and Australia and the US were like connecting and like sharing their love for like weird media, like all of that fun stuff. It's like a different internet now. And I, in that sense, maybe I was a Pollyanna about it, but it's really, to me, I'm not as surprised about how innovative young people are, and they can be problematic too. So I'm not trying to, blame it all on the grown-ups, but I'm always incredibly shocked at how reactive, draconian, and negative the response on the grown-up side is. And that's happening right now with, the appropriating of the mental health crisis to be, to tamp down on youth agency online. And all of these dynamics are very familiar in the current moment. And now the same group of voices is piling onto AI and using young people as the wedge issue to sort of limit rights and freedoms and access to AI. I think the thing that's quite different with AI is that compared to when we were starting to do our work, I think there is an awareness of the social and cultural costs of new technology that did not exist when the internet was first rolling out. So the quickness through which like policy and like critical people have piled on and at least raised concern seems quite different. And I think for this crew, why I have so much, hope for the research coming out of the center is that the age is moving downstream, right, for who's going to be driving the innovations. So with conversational agents, we're not quite at that point yet because Siri and Alexa aren't quite they're not like GPT level powerful, but we're at a point where, little kids are already swiping through their YouTube feeds and, engaging with algorithms on an everyday basis. But once they're sort of in everyday conversation with voice activated AIs and their toys and appliances and everything, the littles are going to be driving so much. They're going to be doing things that are going to be completely unexpected to the elders, and I think it's a very different environment, and that part feels unpredictable. And then the third thing that feels quite different is that unlike the early days of the internet or even the mobile phone, which was like, Japan rolled out the mobile internet and camera phones and was kind of a slightly marginal player. Right now, it's like the biggest, most centralized sort of monopolies in the tech sector are driving this new technology. And that also feels very different and quite important that, we do our research, but we also figure out how to stay very publicly engaged in what's happening in the international arena.
Thanks ever so much. That was very clever. And unsurprisingly so. So thanks very much for being so open and generous. Let's try and get some more questions from the floor. And I'm sure many of you have got questions you want to ask Mimi. So we have the roving mics again. Michael, thank you. Go for it.
I was just looking to see if anyone else wanted to ask a question first. I'm very happy for it, but I've got lots of questions as well. So, Mimi, I wanted to ask, you mentioned that, one of the really important things about the connected learning model is that involvement of industry, and you mentioned the kind of the partnership with Minecraft, for instance. I wanted to ask, what are the best examples you've seen of people within your own network or other academics working with industry to genuinely explore the space of children's learning or just understanding how children and young people connect with digital technologies? Because I think it's one of those things that's really difficult for us as researchers. We don't have that natural affinity. We haven't had that experience in industry to really kind of understand how industry ticks, if you like. So yeah, I just wondered if you could talk about some best examples.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard one. And, I feel like some of the ways that it has been happening are not very intentional or planned. So the way that, at least from my vantage point, we have a lot of our students end up going into industry research, or our partners in the nonprofit sector. There's kind of a flow of talent that cuts across industry and research and nonprofits. And so over time, as industry has started to hire people who do, research with children or ethnography, it's really about the relationships, honestly. So there isn't like a magic formula of like how you break into industry, at least from my perspective. There may be a magic formula that I don't know, but it's really about who I know, who invites me into conversations. So I am consulting with multiple platforms in our Minecraft work. Again, it's it's very relational, it's very connected learning-y. For better and worse, there's problems with it, right? Because you can't just manufacture social capital. It's a very inaccessible form of access. But you know, I'm in conversation with a lot of research groups and industry groups because within all of the platforms there is a group of people who does care about kids and families, and they're always looking for external validation and input into their work if there's space within those corporations to do it. So I think there it's like, you know, make friends, send your students into industry. Think of that as a viable pipeline for how we build relationships. We have to have people on the inside for the bigger industries. And then the other model, which is very difficult, is you know, those rare examples of commercially successful platforms that do have a research-informed component. So the Scratch platform is a good example. It's kind of the exception that proves the rule because it's very difficult to scale something that has come from a university context. Like, it really is not done very often. And then when you're talking about AI and other things, the sort of accessibility, like we don't have at the, in the R&D, the nonprofit R&D sector, we do not have the resources to compete anymore. So I think Scratch, I think what we're seeing with, you know, some of the Sesame, you know, Street kind of, you know, there's partners who do have a big footprint in the kids space. So partnering with some of these organizations like Sesame Workshop or Scratch that do have a nonprofit or mission-based, I mean, Road Trip Nation. There's a few who, it's hard to like break into that and try to roll your own at this point. The digital ecosystem is just not very kind to new entrants. But I think those organizations, like building relationships, building them into your grants, you know, as a partner, just as you would cultivate a relationship with a school or library or community-based organization, having those kinds of relationships with industry partners seems, you know, something that I don't think we're really trained to do as much, but we've been trying to do a lot more of, and you know, we've, like, even at the Connected Learning Lab, I think we're just going to start like an annual partner convening every year that will bring in both community-based and industry partners, and just figuring out ways to keep relationships warm rather than try to think very transactionally about a particular form of access. I think that is generically true, but maybe even more so when you're trying to cross kind of a divide between for-profit and nonprofit.
Thanks. I can see why they don't let cultural anthropologists run the economy then. It's about relationships and exchange, yeah. Lucy.
Thanks, Mimi. I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that tension. I'm really interested in what you were saying about the critical diagnostics and finding those spaces for potentiality. Over your sort of journey, have you any insights on how to kind of diffuse the tension?
Yeah, it's really hard, and the climate right now is very, it's even more polarizing, and it feels very, especially if you're doing work that's equity-oriented or about racial justice, or, you know, these kinds of topics are like Me Too related topics. They create a context of risk and vulnerability and not taking kind of a critical approach, and so it's a risky, like, kind of fraught environment. So I think in some ways it's gotten even more challenging. You know, our network was a safer space, right? We weren't like brawling in public about these issues. So like creating safer spaces where you can have those conversations without it being tweeted and being canceled online, like that's kind of an obvious strategy. But I think just simply saying, look, you know, we each have our lane was like the thing that was most helpful. And then gently reminding critical folks that the critique is not a solution. And that's also incredibly important because a lot of times, and that you have to work together to achieve the solution, right? And that we respect the critique. The critique is important. We're not we're not denying the importance of the critique. It's absolutely the first and most important step. But are we at a point where we need more critique? Do we understand the problem well enough to back out of the critique and start talking about solutions? And that's very specific, because sometimes there are genuinely new problems. Like, I think I'm doing a lot of learning on, sort of ableism, for example, which is not an area that I've had a lot of background. And to me, like, a lot of the critiques around the neurodiversity movement and so on are incredibly eye-opening and new to me. So it's like each issue is at a different level in terms of the critique, but being respectful of the fact that the critique is important, but also understanding that activism is an important tool, but it's a very narrow tool. And you don't have, and sometimes the tools employed by critical activism actually work against the long-term institutionalization of solutions. And really being strategic and understanding that we're not denying the critique by saying we're going towards a solution that's not about the public discourse and public critique is not the solution to the institutionalized problems. It's the starting point for understanding what they are. And I think that's hard, right? It's a hard pill to swallow in some ways, because the feelings about the injustice are true and powerful. But it's a very tricky dynamic, and it's intergenerationally fraught too, because I'm sort of this old person saying, it's going to take time. We have to take things one step at a time. And, you have to bring the stakeholders. It's not like a fast thing. And it's kind of boring when you get into that level. So,
Can I add, because I was part of probably the tension.
Yes.
I also think one of the, I don't want to sound stupid here. The MacArthur Foundation was a private philanthropic organization funding the projects. So this meant that they were more agnostic towards the importance of scholars from universities than perhaps an ARC-funded collection of scholars is, which is the situation we're in here. In other words, trying to get different kinds of funders to take an interest and legitimize the work can help break down, or you're never going to get rid of, but can help make more positive and constructive the tension between the critical and the normative kind of. So MacArthur was good because it was just as interested in funding projects and initiatives, local studies, like those that work in New York and Chicago, the libraries and the out-of-school centers, and that it was more able to be pluralistic in its approach, and that helps that problem. Whereas, by definition, if you get a lot of scholars together and a lot of academics, they have more at stake in staying in their lane and not looking who's cutting in. It's just what I'd add, because it's...
Agreed.
Susan.
Hello, I'm Susan Danby. I'm the director of the centre, and thank you for this wonderful conversation today. My question, first of all, I was really pleased to hear you talk about early childhood. I know that when we put the centre together, which is birth to around 8 years of age, there was a lot of kind of caution around that, saying, well, really it's all happening at the other end of the childhood, youth, and but we went ahead and we were able to be successful with the early years. So a couple of questions. One is around the early years, and where do you see, we know things are being pushed downward, that downward push, but are there particular areas that you think we should focus on in early childhood? That's the first question. And the second one is how we can do better at getting our messages out. So, for instance, we've got connections with government. We've been doing a lot of submissions to government, involved in conversations with government. But we're very interested. It's a very interesting time to be in Australia right now because the current government is very interested in early childhood. So we've been really wanting to have a say in that policy space a bit more. I'd be really eager to hear some of your possibilities of how we might go about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you all are very well positioned to, have that bigger public profile and impact because the work in early childhood, there just isn't that much of it, honestly, and it's really hard to do. So, I mean, it's hard enough to get, access to like 16-year-olds on the internet in research context, but then, even in the MacArthur era, we did have, scholars who were doing and interested in early childhood, but you have to gain access through families and community. It's a challenging arena to work in, and so for a lot of structural reasons, there hasn't been as much work. Not only because teens were obviously taking over the internet during a particular period, but just the realities of what it means to do research in early childhood context. So it's really important that there is a center and a group of scholars that are really digging into that and supported to do that work. And it feels more urgent than ever because, even for me, I'm known as a youth person, but all the phone calls I'm getting from the press is for the past 5 years has been about, what do I do with my 2-year-old and the iPad? And that's kind of where I think the everyday, the bread and butter issues are coming to roost, that people don't know what to do. And as soon as the kid, should I buy the talking Elmo? These are gonna be sort of everyday decisions, I think, that families and educators are gonna be grappling with. So I think that both on the, my personal interests have tended to be in the out-of-school space, and, I'm curious to hear from all of you, that it feels like the consumer technologies around AI are going to be where we're already seeing a ton of kind of concern and sort of likely policy interest, and from the platform perspective too, there's been, because of the external pressure to deal with the littles, the platforms are actually investing in feature sets and so on for the under 8s now. So I think that there's really an opportunity to, whatever is happening with kids' YouTube, whatever is happening with smart toys, all of these kind of everyday, when Alexa starts getting as smart as ChatGPT, everything that you're doing now and looking at those technologies before they've become completely AI powered seems incredibly important. There's just it's a lot of open space. There's so little research that everything is a contribution. And publishing in ways that are really kind of distilling the implications for parents and policymakers is really, really important. So that's the kind of capacity building that I think a center can do, is okay, here's a research study, here's the bullet points, here's the white paper, here's the talking points for the press, and just that was one of the things that MacArthur did actually for me. From the very first study we released, got a media professional, I had this long list of findings, and then they're just no, 2 things, and they don't care about your findings. They want to know what they should do. And that's the only thing you lead with. You can say 2 things about what you found, but you say 5 things about what they should do. So that kind of training is so antithetical to my training as a researcher, but it was absolutely right, because when I talked to reporters, I was oh, and there were kids doing this, and there's should I friend my daughter on Facebook? That was the only thing they cared about. So I think that kind of training, and it's not you can try to be super strategic, but the fastest path to impact is being noticed and visible and in play within, the press and public domain. And then you get inbound requests. So it's always about cultivating the visibility and waiting for people to reach out to you, I think.
Thanks. I'm going to have one quick question from Tamar, then we'll wrap.
So it's almost been answered, so you did a great job there. So the question was very much going to be on that sort of translational end, and you've just sort of described the relationship with media people, which I think is vital for us to think about. But I guess, is there one more tip in there for how do we try and keep a little bit of the complexity, but still be media friendly enough that they'll come back and ask us and not have Julian give a 14-page answer that they'll go, God, I don't know which bit I can use. How do we keep a little bit of the complexity but still be soundbite friendly, I guess?
Well, I think that people like stories. So I feel like if you can have a story about a child or a family or an educator that really encapsulates the values and the message, it's a vehicle for complexity. So it's like stories and telling people what to do, recommendations, or implications and recommendations. And then the rest of the complexity has to stay in the scholarly domain, probably. Sorry.
Okay, we've got to draw to a close there, but thank you so much.
Thank you for, I meant to plug the
No, we did that
the
for you.
summit. Okay, I forgot about that.
But I just want to thank you for your kindness and openness and wisdom in reflecting on the process and the content of the experience that you've had and how useful it is for all of us here. And Mimi will be around, and I'm sure we'll be more than happy to answer more questions and chat during the rest of the day. So thank you very much, Mimi.